I think that what history shows is that shaping the direction of technology in order to achieve desired social outcomes is rarely tried because it's incredibly difficult. And when it has been tried, it has failed. The main attempts were in communism. The research effort was directed with an eye to the social impacts of the technologies that would be invented. They had, communist theorists basically saying, here's how this technology will or won't lead to the ideal socialist society in the Soviet Union. And it never worked out that way because, first of all, these people's social theories were very poor. They did not really understand how society worked. And I would argue that our social theories now are perhaps marginally better than those of the Soviets, but they are still poor. And we do not understand the economic impacts of certain technologies. Certainly, I could pull examples from history of us failing to anticipate the economic impact of technologies. Paul Krugman saying that the internet will have no effect on the economy. He's a great economist, one of the greatest alive, but that was wrong.
Hi, welcome to Innovative Minds. My pleasure to be here as your host. Just call me T+. This show is a forum for leaders in tech and politics to discuss how to solve today's problems with today's tools. Today, our special guest is Noah Smith, a writer and blogger who shares his opinion pieces at No Opinion. I'm also here with Taiwan's digital minister Audrey Tang. In this episode, we'll discuss the future of AI economics, explore innovative solutions to repair the information ecosystem, and suggest ways to depolarize public debate. Okay, so before we get started, I want to introduce our two guests today. Hailing from the US, Noah is a writer and blogger who shares his opinion pieces at No Opinion, covering topics such as economics, technology, geopolitics, and sometimes culture. Noah holds a PhD in economics and tends to back up his analyses with a large number of figures. He is a proficient writer who believes that society is more effective when everyone understands the facts a little bit better. Thank you so much for being here, Noah.
Thanks for having me on.
Audrey Tang is Taiwan's digital minister. She became Taiwan's youngest minister without portfolio in 2016 when she headed the public digital innovation space. She has been a hacktivist for over 2 decades. She is also a promoter of open source innovation. Hi, Audrey.
Good local time, everyone, and hi, Noah.
Hey, good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you again. This time in lower resolution, but still very happy to meet you.
Let's start by talking about technology. Noah, you claim to be a techno-optimist. At the end of 2020, you were betting that the 2020s would see an explosion in technological progress compared to the previous decade. Do you still hold this belief?
Yes, so far I think that is being borne out. I didn't know anything about generative AI at the time, but now, that sort of exploded onto the scene. And I think that in the other areas that I predicted technological progress, we've seen a lot of my predictions pan out. They weren't really very bold predictions compared to what other people were saying. I think a lot of people were very optimistic. I think in biotech, in batteries and battery applications, and of course the growth of solar power, robotics, cheap space launch. I think that and drones, of course, we're really seeing a lot of the progress that I predicted. And then in AI, the progress has been faster than I predicted. So I'm pretty happy.
Among the inventions you've just mentioned, you've argued that the decreasing cost of solar energy and batteries might be one of the most significant technological advancements of this decade. As a result, you believe that our discussions on climate change must be revised. Can you elaborate further on this topic?
Well, yeah. So I think that a lot of our discussions of climate change are focused on the idea of sacrifice. How much economic growth should we sacrifice in order to, fight climate change and stop the world from roasting? But now those debates were basically established maybe 15 years ago, when solar power was still very expensive, batteries were extremely expensive, and no one really seriously entertained, except for a few futurists and techno-optimists, no one really seriously entertained the idea that these technologies would very quickly become so cheap that they would be cheaper than fossil fuels, actually. And so now they are. That technological revolution happened. Solar is now cheaper than fossil fuels for, on the margin for very many areas and applications. And battery storage is getting extremely cheap. And then also for cars and for storage, for intermittency, for solar, et cetera, those technological revolutions have really changed the game. So now what we have to do to decarbonize is not to shut down economic growth. It's not to cut back and consume less and accept a poorer standard of living. That's out. And there are still some people in the UK saying that, possibly because their growth is poor anyway. And of course, but it's wrong now. And so what's right is that what we need to do to decarbonize is to grow more. We need to invest more in replacing our fossil fuel electricity with solar panels and batteries.
Audrey, you also stand out for your optimism about the future of technology. Can you tell us why?
The focus is now on a just transition or transformation instead of on degrowth or cutting back living standard. The same as it happens in the green energy sector has happened in digital transformation as well. Before the pandemic, many people think that only by meeting face to face can we build real connections, socially or professionally. But during the pandemic, we have seen that it is actually possible to build weak links and then gradually into actual working or social relationships over the internet. And now we're after the pandemic, people basically think, oh, actually hybrid conferences, hybrid workspaces, and so on are the way to go. And the focus is now on developing technologies that fosters more collaboration across more diversity instead of a trade-off saying, oh, you have to only collaborate with people you intimately know, or that in order to be diverse, we have to sacrifice a little bit on our ways to collaborate. So not accepting trade-offs, but rather developing toward more collaboration and more diversity. That is what we've been seeing in terms of digital technologies.
Let's narrow our focus and discuss artificial intelligence. Several guests on this show have expressed their distrust of this technology. The most common concerns include the potential loss of control, concentration of resources in the hands of a few companies, and the opaque nature of its algorithms. Noah, could you please share your thoughts on these concerns and provide your views on AI?
Well, I think if you look at history, there's no example of a technology that was not used for bad purposes by some people. Industrial technologies were obviously used for war and social control, and digital technologies have been used for mass surveillance, and social control, and also now being used for war. So I think that you're going to see AI used for all these bad things, and it will be ambiguous as to whether or not it was humans directing AI to do bad things or AI doing bad things on its own, because we're very bad at attributing intentionality to these constructs. But these things will be used for bad because everything else was too. But so far, I would argue that everything that we've ever invented has been, with maybe one or two exceptions, has been used for more good than bad. That there hasn't yet been a technology that was unbalanced bad. And of course, we could have a nuclear holocaust tomorrow and I could be proven wrong after I was incinerated. So you never really know. But I think that our track record is good for using technologies for good. Increasing our capabilities with regards to the natural world generally does good things because we make choices that are good for us. And it's not always good for, the animals and plants of the world. And we don't really consider them, and we often do bad things to them. And we should stop that. We should have morality, and we should have responsibility, be responsible stewards of the planet. And but in general, I think there's good reason to be optimistic. Now, as far as the dangers from AI, there's a number of groups of these. There's some people who think AI will be unfair, that AI will embed racism, et cetera. I feel like these voices have become quieter lately as it's become clear that this problem is not huge. I think that there's a very vocal group of people, but pretty small group of people, who thinks that AI will become a sort of a destructive agent and, destroy the organics like Skynet in the Terminator, or perhaps something like that, AI risk. And I think that it's very difficult to disprove that. You can't really say that this will never happen, but no one really sees any signs of it's happening. I guess Bing got mad at some people for a week, and it got very mad. But other than that, we'll see. I think that My guess is that if that happens, it will cause small problems before it causes large problems, and we'll learn from the small problems. Before AI literally destroys the world, it will maybe just kill a few people, and then we'll say, oh, it killed a few people, maybe that's bad. I don't think it's going to be like in the Terminator, where the first thing it does is presses the world destroyer button. And I think the third concern is really economic. It's the idea that this technology will replace humans and that humans will become useless. And I think that although that's technically possible and we can't rule it out, I think there are many reasons to think that this is not going to happen.
So I think this, what Noah's been talking about, is the idea of a slow takeoff, meaning that the harms that AI causes will be on the time scale of years before it becomes truly catastrophic. And by that time, humanity will have coordinated to mitigate such risks exactly as we have done during the pandemic times. And I do agree with that. I think nowadays the top frontier AI labs all hold this view that if we can help it, a slower takeoff is better than a lab hidden somewhere doing original research for 10 years and suddenly appear with some sort of super intelligence. Instead, we should democratize the risks assessments as well as risk mitigation. After all, in a lab, you cannot predict how AI is going to impact society, and societal scale risks require societal input to democratize, for example, open red teaming, which means that people can have ways to find flaws, vulnerabilities, problems, adversarial attacks on AIs, especially with open source models, before it became truly civilizational scale risks. So I do agree that a slower takeoff is a much better way of taking off.
Now, I would like to shift our focus to the economic aspect of AI. Some analysts predict that the development of artificial general intelligence models could lead to explosive economic growth. We're talking of growth rates of 20% per year, as AI could automate most of the tasks currently done by humans. Noah, I'm curious to know, what do you think about the possibility of such a scenario?
Well, I would definitely bet many thousands of dollars against the scenario of explosive growth, but not because I don't believe in it. It's because that would make me more hedged. And as a finance professor, you learn that you should bet against your existing idiosyncratic risk. And therefore, betting against an explosive growth takeoff is a form of insurance, because if there's an explosive growth takeoff, we'll be so rich that even many thousands of dollars won't be that big a deal for us. I mean, you must consider the present value of how much you could have gotten for investing those ahead of time. But then again, you should consider the diminishing marginal utility of wealth.
Okay, I can already see the charts and formulas. Maybe we can project that here.
Audrey, what do you think about the possibility of explosive economic growth?
Yeah, it's going to happen to some sectors and not all sectors. This is what we have been looking at, because in some sectors, most of the tasks are quantifiable, meaning that you can specify exactly how much good performance is good enough performance, how much more performance is excellent performance, and things like that. On the other hand, once we augment the work with many automated tasks, in other sectors, it requires much more connection to fellow humans. It requires more real-time adaptation to the rising expectations and so on. And these sectors, although it still benefits from AI's ability to deal with many complex issues, ends up letting you serve more people, more customers, and so on, but without significant automatable portions of the collaboration part. So if we look at things from this collaborative diversity, plurality lens, there's only a few sectors where the AGI or AI can automate both the collaboration part and the reach to diversity part.
I see. As AI automates more processes, we will need to increase collaboration and care in other areas. Noah, how could we regulate AI to make the best use of it?
I think that what history shows is that shaping the direction of technology in order to achieve desired social outcomes is rarely tried because it's incredibly difficult. And when it has been tried, it has failed. The main attempts were in communism. Research effort was directed with an eye to the social impacts of the technologies that would be invented. They had, communist theorists basically saying, here's how this technology will or won't lead to the ideal socialist society in the Soviet Union. And it never worked out that way because, first of all, these people's social theories were very poor. They did not really understand how society worked. And I would argue that our social theories now are perhaps marginally better than those of the Soviets, but they are still poor. And we do not understand the economic impacts of certain technologies. Certainly, I could pull examples from history of us failing to anticipate the economic impacts of technologies. Paul Krugman saying that the internet will have no effect on the economy. He's a great economist, one of the greatest alive, but that was wrong. And in the early days of electricity, people had no idea that electricity would cause production processes to be disaggregated and supply chained. That was just not a thing people understood would happen. Very few people could predict the effects of CNC machine tools or the automobile or a million other technologies I could name. The effects are incredibly hard to predict. So if we're trying to, divert resources from one technology to another technology on based on assumptions that we can predict how these technologies will affect society, I think that second link is broken, that we don't know how the technologies will affect society, and it's complete hubris and arrogance to think that we can predict that ahead of time enough to control it. So instead, what I would do is I would focus on building robust social institutions so that whatever the effect of new technologies, the benefits go to workers, to consumers, to all members of society, and create more equality in society. We have institutions that can do this. We have labor unions. We have a regulatory state that we can adjust at will. We have taxes and spending and a welfare state. And we have all those things, and we should make those things more robust and stronger. And I think that's our strength, and we've done this before. With industrial technology, in the early days of industrial technology, the inequality widened a huge amount. It was called the Gilded Age, and conditions for workers were very poor, and consumers were not enriched nearly as much as they should have been. But in the early and mid 20th centuries, we created strong labor unions, welfare states, and other aspects of what we now call social democracy. And then our societies became much more equal, and prosperity was shared much more broadly. We should learn from that success and create those, just strengthen those institutions more so that we can handle whatever comes our way.
Yeah, in a sense, the associations and worker strikes and so on are social technologies. They are institutional guardrails, if you will, against this kind of widening inequality. I'm reminded of the negotiations 2015, the Uber X example, which we first deployed the Polis technology. And one of the very important consensus across drivers and passengers and associations and the co-ops are that it's a very effective supervised AI to dispatch cars, but it must never be used to undercut existing meters. On the other hand, surge pricing, which is improving existing meters when there's a high demand, that's totally fine. And this reminds me of a recent comparable results. The Hollywood writers, right? They said that generative AI can be used by writers to enhance their own writing, but it must not be used by the studios in order to replace writers. So is this the kind of social technology, the associations and strikes and labor unions that you have in mind when we are facing generative AI?
I think so. About the writers' strike, imagine if they had not made that deal and studios could fire all their writers and replace them with people from the basement, janitors, using generative AI to write things. Those janitors from the basement using generative AI would simply be writers. Those are now writers, and they're using a tool to write. Under the agreement with the Writers Guild Union, writers are allowed to use generative AI to write. And so they can't be forced to do it, but they're allowed to use it themselves. So the only difference between this and the counterfactual situation where the writers were all fired and new writers were hired to use AI, the only difference is that now it's mandated that unionized writers be the ones to be able to use AI. So there's nothing here about not using AI for writing. The writers can still use AI. And if AI is a tool that increases the productivity of writers, that allows them to write more scripts better and faster, then they can still do that. But they will exert more ownership over the monetary proceeds of that labor instead of studios owning more of it.
Right, so
yes.
AI become part of the means of production that is under joint control by workers instead of just totally abstracted out from the existing workers association. Yeah, I think this is a vision that's very much worth working towards.
It seems that you are saying we currently have adequate public policy tools to handle the growth of AI. Is that correct?
Well, I wouldn't go that far, because I think that in the idea of the types of tools that we have, those are good, but those might not be the only thing we need. We might need new tools. So when labor unions were new, when industrial technology happened, you had some professional guilds of artisans before, but you never had anything like a modern labor union. That is new to the industrial era. And the welfare state, there had been things like a welfare state before, but it was different. So the modern welfare state was significantly different. So these institutions can either change a whole lot or just be new ones can be invented. And I don't rule out the possibility that we might need to invent new ones. One that many, many people talk about is a universal basic income, which would be a big modification to our welfare state. I think that that's certainly a possibility. I don't know that that's the best idea. There may be other better ideas for modifications to the welfare state. I think in terms of labor unions, we may see that labor unions change. In the United States, there's lots of discussion of switching to sectoral bargaining or labor boards. A labor board or council is a council between labor, government, and management that all come together and fix wages and or working standards, labor standards. And so those are used extensively in Australia and have had a good track record in Australia. And so I think that it's not a new institution, but it's a new institution to the United States. And California just created its first one for fast food workers. And so that's a new thing. And so, yes, so I think that we may have to invent new institutions, modify some old ones, adapt some things from other countries, and play around. We're going to have to tinker and improve. And there's no reason we can't, because we've done it before.
I see. We'll certainly have to adapt and invent new tools to meet new challenges. Now, let's shift our attention towards the information ecosystem in the United States and Taiwan. Noah, could you please elaborate on why you believe it is more difficult to counter disinformation than to spread it?
Well, there's an old quote, I believe it's from Mark Twain, who said, "A lie can get halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its boots." And so it is very, very low cost to create disinformation. It is, it's also low cost to create true information. But the second law of thermodynamics actually tells us that there is infinitely more disinformation than true information in the world. So simply because the multiplicity of the macro state is higher. Anyway, but there's infinitely more falsehood than truth in the world. You can easily just create falsehoods and spam them out into the world as easily as you can relate a true fact. And discovering the truth is often a torturous and difficult process. So for example, in science, it takes huge budgets and some of the smartest people in the world, many decades and many contentious arguments and whatever, to determine what's really going on. But someone who's going to lie about climate change and make up something like, oh, actually, the world's getting cooler, you can make that up in about a minute. And so producing truth is incredibly expensive. And for similar reasons, debunking lies is extremely expensive. And so the idea that true information will crowd out false information, I think ignores the cost of production of these two things.
Could we frame this in the context of public goods versus private goods?
That is a good way of putting it, actually. I hadn't actually thought of it in those terms, but if you think of accurate information as a public good, if I make money selling lies to people, if I go on my blog and tell you that global warming is a hoax and that, whatever, and I make, or, vaccines don't work, I can make money doing that. And, but the people who are hurt by that are not me. There's a whole lot of people hurt by that because they hear these, anti-vaxxer perspectives and they think, I don't need a vaccine because I read this guy, and then they die, and then that's bad. So yes, negative externalities, which are a form of, public goods problem, I think are a good way to think about this.
Audrey, can you tell us more about how large language models can help us deal with this cost asymmetry Noah just mentioned?
Yes, certainly. I'll just call them language models because what's large today is very small tomorrow. So language models are useful because it captures the meaning, the semantics of truth, and can translate it in a way that is more convincing to any target. So the same persuasion technologies that can be used to build addiction and so on can actually also be used to find bridges. So as to, for example, if a target group is vehemently anti-vax, still they care about some other values. And a language model can help to put a frame around the vaccination issue and to deliver the scientific outputs in a way that makes more sense to any target group. We've already seen COVAX, which is a GovZero project and now adopted in other countries as well, to train their own language models. And the language model only does one thing, which is when people see disinformation or propaganda or whatever online, this AI assistant just very helpfully applies some sort of Socratic method to remind you to check for information integrity in these regards. So it doesn't purport to disseminate truth. It rather puts people in the mood of more balanced information integrity requirements. That is to say, a more journalistic setting of minds. And it's quite useful, actually, because instead of taking anything down or censorship or mandated notice, which all could be, abused by any centralized state, this kind of more like community notes allows everyone to contribute their piece of facts. And instead of having, to manually correct each and every disinformation, this allows the people to contribute to a commons, a public good, which is a shared language model that can then be used as an automated response to anything that is going viral that may need some critical thinking applied to it.
I feel it somehow goes back to what Noah said earlier. We have a successful history of using technology for positive impact. Audrey, do you have anything to add?
Sure. I think, so Noah mentioned quite a few new social technology or institutions. There's a few more. For example, Noah talked about protecting animals and the planet and so on. The idea of nature personhood, right? Somebody representing a river in a board setting so as to be able to sue for damage to the river's health, for example. That is something that is already applied to Wanganui River in New Zealand and Ganges in India and so on. And this is one institutional innovation that I would like to see more representation, especially now generative AI can synthesize a living, talking river avatar that can argue for its case in a board meeting, right? So that's another way to think about this augmented digital democracy. We've also seen a lot of people trying out citizen assemblies, which is like juries, except it's just to make sense of a emerging technology. So these are people like randomly selected, statistically representative. OpenAI recently just tried this with 1,000 randomly selected people, and they gave very nuanced recommendations on how to make generative AI, less likely to accidentally build over-reliance or addiction, and suggest many good governance setups and so on. So these are newer forms of democracy that can work at the speed of transformative technologies and often helped by transformative technologies. So that's what I have in mind when I say we can innovate also on democracy itself as a technology.
That sounds great to me. I mean, we've done it before, right? We've done this before. Newspapers were themselves an innovation. Letters to the editor were an innovation. That seems very quaint to us now, but that was a technological innovation that no one could do that before. radio stations, independent radio stations, that was an innovation. In terms of democracy, many sorts of modern democratic institutions are very new. They things like school boards and community input meetings and all kinds of things like that are novel institutions. Well, in terms of novel, they're 100 to 150 years old, and that's not very old in the grand sweep of history. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we've already seen many new media types of institutions, like community notes. That's a new thing in the world. But I think that we're going to see more of that, and that the pessimists look at the mid 2010s, this era of chaos, when the chaos agents sort of stole a march, so to speak, on the builders, the people whose goal was to sow chaos and division in our society, for various reasons. Those people got ahead of the game, and they started using technologies for destruction. Well, we had to see how they were misused before we could imagine how they could be used positively, because creating positive uses that are robust to misuse is difficult, requires you to see the misuse. We've got to test things to failure, observe the failure modes, and correct. I think it's exactly the same thing I thought we'd do with AI, Skynet, whatever. But it's in terms of democracy and social institutions as well. I think we'll observe and correct. We'll see in the 2010s, new social media technologies were used, especially feeds were used to just spread massive amounts of misinformation and also to create extreme social division and bitterness. And I think that now a lot of smart people have been working since then on ways to improve the situation, and they're making slow progress, and it might take them decades, but I think eventually we'll find something that works even better than the world before the internet.
Audrey, do you agree with that statement?
Yes. Well, you just described my life's work, right? And I think especially community notes. We've had Vitalik on this show talking about community notes. And I think the fact that it's not just a feature of X, but rather it is a general purpose open source technology. This needs to be understood by more people. I had a long conversation with Nick Clegg, in charge of international policy of Meta, and I'm quite surprised that Meta is considering community nodes in a very kind of favorable light, because at the moment, of course, they work with the International Fact-Checking Network, the Poynter Institute, and so on. But what the limitation is that only the professional fact-checkers get to fact-check. And when the exponential growth of disinformation, thanks to generative AI's way to write very convincing random noise, that's going to be very tasking for the professional fact-checkers to do. On the other hand, the community nodes, because it doesn't limit who can participate to build such bridging narratives, every community node participant can actually use assistive AI however they want. And so that democratizes the access to the fact-checking part from the existing just 2 institutions in Taiwan to essentially 2 million or 20 million people in Taiwan.
I think generative AI is going to be a particularly difficult technology to adapt to in terms of disinformation, not because people will be, worse in using it, but because the technology itself contains disinformation generation within it, which they euphemistically call hallucination. And I have not been able to use generative AI in my writing process. I am still writing articles by, just thinking them and typing them out. And I increasingly feel that this is a Stone Age way to write, but it's because the new technologies don't help. They tell so many lies. I mean, they spit out so much false information that the process of laboriously checking what they write is actually more time consuming than the process of simply writing it myself. And so and it's not just point mutations. It's not just small lies that they tell. They spin whole vast narratives of falsehood. And in some ways, GPT-4 is worse than ChatGPT 3.5. And so my favorite example was when we asked them, we asked the ChatGPTs, to tell us about an economist's opinion on wage boards, which I mentioned before. They said, what is Arindrajit Dubey's opinion on wage boards? And it didn't just give us a lie. It made up fake papers. It made up a whole narrative of how this guy who's the chief champion of wage boards in the US was a lifetime opponent of wage boards. It was exactly 180 degrees from the truth, supported with all kinds of fake information, paragraphs upon paragraphs of made up lies to support a single lying narrative. That's going to be a difficult technology to harness for truth, because lies are already, it doesn't even need humans to make it lie. It likes to do it on its own.
Yeah, language models model language. So I only use it for language queries like my English is not perfect, spot the typos and inconsistencies. And that it does perfectly because, it can tell like plural forms and things like that more than a human eye can catch. And for translation, where the input number of bits is exactly the same or slightly higher than the output, it does it okay. So yeah, I think what's needed is a kind of competence of using these technologies in a way that fits its original model, which is modeling language, instead of modeling the economic research world. I don't think it's being trained to do that.
I was about to ask you, Noah, the secret behind your productivity. But now I understand it is not ChatGPT.
Not yet. When AI gets good enough for me to use it to write, people always ask me, are you afraid that AI will take your job? No. Once I get AI to start working for me as a writer, instead of one article, I will write 100 articles. And all of this world will be taken over by Noah Smith thought. So watch out. Once I get AI on my side, I will win.
I, for one, look forward.
All right, Noah Smith and Audrey Tong thought.
I am excited to read more of Noah Smith's work. I want to express my gratitude to both of you for an energizing and optimistic conversation about the future of technology. In the upcoming part of this interview, we will explore strategies to reduce polarization in public discourse. And if you like today's episode, be sure to subscribe, share, and let us know what you think. See you next time on Innovative Minds.
And so there's very few places where Americans all get together and meet each other and learn to iron out their differences and blah, blah, blah. There's one institution left, which is college. It is the one functional social institution left in America, and it only works for a little less than half the people. So you've got half of the people in America subject to this very strong social institution that teaches them certain values and health and whatnot, and employment and skills and all these things, and builds community and networks and and exposes people to diversity, teaches them about people different than themselves, and you have a little less than half the people in the country using that institution. And the progressive solution to that was free college for everybody. So everyone goes to college, K through 12, which is our existing compulsory public education, let's say. K through universal public education, but would then become K through 16. And that college would just become 4 more years of school that everyone goes to. And this dream has basically failed. That dream's completely failed, because it turns out that's for a lot of people, that's too long to take out of your working life. That's, the human lifespan didn't increase enough to really do this. And a lot of people just can't handle the amount of technical work in college because they're not well prepared by a family background or good schools or whatever. They're not as well prepared, and so they can't handle it. And so as a result, the dream of universal college, we can get marginally there by increasing the number of people who go to college, but we've stalled out at a little less than 50%, and college enrollment rates have now been going down. Hello, I'm Noah Smith, blogger at No Opinion. See you on TaiwanPlus.
Hello, I'm Audrey Tang, Taiwan's digital minister. See you on TaiwanPlus.